I love the conflict because there's so much truth and there's so much energy. I mean, conflict is, you know, we get very fascinated by the drawing together. I use the erotic opposition, like coming together, that powerful thing. And this is pushing us apart. But it's so powerful. There's so much energy in it. And there's so much truth. And it's very intimate. You know, people don't understand that when they're in a conflict, they're in a deep, really deep relationship. And there's so much potential creativity. And to be able to discover the commonalities and agreements, I like that challenge. That it's appearing as two, like maximum two, but in fact, it's completely one underneath. It's just a manifestation of the one becoming two. So how do you honor that?
Great to see you, Dan. Welcome. Yeah, really a pleasure to have you here. I have the pleasure these days of being on your course on the Tibetan masters, and I also have the pleasure of having a child with one of your students and monks. So yeah, I've gotten to spend a bit more time with you lately, which has been a pleasure. And I invited you to this because I know that you have a lot to say about what I call the relating arts, or like what's it like to be with people, and how can we do that in ways that are maybe nicer for us and the people around us. So yeah, that's why you're here. And what I would want to start with is maybe just you telling a little bit about yourself, and yeah, where do you come from? What's your background? And then we'll take it from there.
Okay, good. It's also been really nice for me, Peter, to get to know you, and I'm very excited for you and your partner to have a child. I think it's such a beautiful expression, of course, of life, you know, so I can't help but be excited. So about me, what I would say is that there are two things that really influenced who I became as an adult, and also what I've put my time and attention on over the years. And one was that I grew up in a very dynamic family. I had 4 siblings, and my mother and father they were just naturally pretty energized people and curious and engaged. And my house had a lot of, there was always something going on with my family and my extended family. My mother's family there were 10 siblings, and they would visit with my grandmother and stay up all night long. They would stay up until 5 in the morning every time they got together, and just talk and exchange and laugh and make fun of each other and occasionally fight. And it was a very dynamic experience. At the same time, because it was so dynamic, there was also, when fights or conflicts emerged, I think just as a participant who enjoyed so much the exchanges, and then when people would become like hostile to each other or aggressive or alienated, that I would often just be naturally inquiring what happened, what exactly happened there, and wanting, you know, naturally some sort of resolution to that didn't often emerge. It's just there was a kind of a rupture, and then everyone went about their business, and then at some point everyone picked up where they left off. There were never, like, you know, grand fallings out in my family. People always kind of sort of repaired, but I never got to really watch that in action. So that when I became an adult, it turns out that I didn't know what to do with myself. I mean, I had studied meditation. I did some environmental work in my 20s. I was trained in shiatsu and other forms of touch and embodiment, but nothing really got a hold of me. And I decided at one point to change the question from what do I want to do, kind of as my vocation, to what am I being told I do. And when I changed the question, it was just absolutely immediate that it was like a fairy tale. 3 times in a row, I helped some people sort out a difference, once between my mother and my brother, once between in a decision making with a large group of people. And I don't really remember the third, but I do remember that it happened in three. And so this feedback came back to me immediately that what I was good for was helping people with their disputes. And it just so happened at that same time that I was living in Seattle, and I was looking for a job, and I walked by this place that I didn't know existed, and it was a local dispute resolution center. And it was housed in this big Presbyterian church, and there was a sign outside the door that said that they were looking for a mediator and an administrator. And I really didn't even know that mediation was something people did. So I applied for that job, I got it. And then when I moved back to my home state of Utah, I somehow the word got out that I was in town and that I had been trained in mediation. And the court system, the administrator of the court system reached out to me and asked me if I would apply as the director of alternative dispute resolution for the courts. And they were just starting that program at that time. So it unfolded very naturally from my inquiry and my struggle as a child that I became a mediator by profession. And so all of my interpersonal work that you're talking about and the relationship work that I do is really based in a way on that skill set and on that inquiry that I've had since I was a young person. The complement to that is that when I was seven, not when I was seven, when I was 17, 7 of my good friends died in one way or another. And 4 of my friends were killed in a light plane. They were young. The pilot was only 18 years old, and my other friends one was 18, the other 2 were 17. And they all went up in a plane, and he had just barely learned how to fly. And he flew into a canyon. They went to look at elk in the canyon. And then one of the real tricks is gaining altitude when you encounter a mountain range. Like, you really have to prepare and know how to do that. And he was just too inexperienced. And they crashed, and they were lost for 2 months, from February 13th. And then the crash site was discovered in April. So there was this period of time where they were missing. And then I had 3 other friends, good friends, also die. One was killed in a fight, one was committed suicide, and one was killed in an automobile. So in that period of time, I went from, being focused on, like any 17-year-old, the things that interested me and getting ready to go to college and whatnot, to suddenly being very concerned with, what does life really mean? What does it mean given the fact that we die? What does it mean to be a human being? What is impermanence? And that naturally drew me to the Buddhist tradition. And when I was 22, I was introduced to Buddhist practice, meditation, and the teachings of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche in the Tibetan Buddhist world. And so that confrontation with life and death also really informs the way that I work with people, and what I've discovered through meditation and through this really deep, powerful inquiry about, what does it mean to be human, and what does it mean that our time is limited. So those are the 2 streams that have really flowed into my work in terms of training and orientation and worldview. And then the third, of course, is that when I was 40, I was introduced to Ken Wilber. I'd read some of his work earlier in my life, but then I met him in person, and then I started to train in his seminars that he led at the time. I was one of the leaders and trainers of his seminars, transformational seminars. So I learned a lot more about human transformation and the so-called mechanics of human transformation. And so that also informs my work as well, like some of the principles of the transformational process. The fact that we can transform, but we don't. We don't even always know why, but we do know that we can, and we do. And lots of times we do because there's a crisis. So that's kind of a big picture of how I got to be here with you.
Great. So I would like to continue from where you ended, actually, I'm quite drawn to the question of, like, what is transformation? How does transformation happen?
Mm-hmm.
What does actually well, I worked with cities previously, like urban planning. I've worked with
Yeah.
organizations a bit,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
now I'm, yeah, a bit more in the sort of interpersonal or self-development oriented field. But it
Hmm.
seems like there's the same crux of like, how does anything actually change? Like,
Hmm.
what makes change happen? You have a
Hmm.
good answer for that.
What I will do in response to that, Peter, is I'll just share some of the assumptions that I've learned from Ken Wilber about transformation, and then the Buddhist tradition is also really a transformative practice, as are all the great traditions. If the study and the practice is in the environment in which the myth of the given is overcome and people are actually allowed to grow and change, then that can also happen. So I think Ken would begin by saying that the universe itself evolves. And as we know, he would say that, quarks become atoms, atoms become molecules, molecules become cells, biology happens in this great miracle, life emerges, and that we can put an evolutionary frame on what we understand about the universe, and it submits very powerfully to the idea that it's built into our systems to grow and change and to become more complex. We can also put a being frame or a being experience and see the dimension that doesn't change in who we are, and that is, you could say, intact and uh, continuous from the beginning. So in a way, human beings are perfect as they are, and they also have the opportunity to grow and change. So a transformational frame naturally includes the words evolution, development, and learning. And Ken would say that under the right set of circumstances, with the right kind of guidance, that we can actually evolve and change in any dimension that we choose to. And there are multiple kinds of intelligence. So some of us can become, much better athletes. Some of us who are interested can always become better cooks than we are. We can become more ethical, for example, and we become more skilled at relating, which is really what it is that you're interested in. Like, how do we evolve and become more skilled in terms of our relationships? And um, the probably, if we look at what are the conditions that really allow for transformation, one is intentionality. Like, there has to be a glimpse that it's possible, and that one is interested in how it evolves. So, for example, um, I need to say this part. I don't know how to blend it in quite smoothly, but in terms of kind of our worldviews, they seem to be in the hard drive. In other words, that both individuals and cultures will move through different worldviews and different stages, if you will, of development, or different waves of development. So we might, we all begin in a much more tribal kind of setting, and warlords are very much a part of our history. And then there's a kind of institutionality and traditionalism that sets in, that creates structures and predictability and puts priests and authority in place, and laws start to emerge. Then the modernist worldview emerges, and that those are unfolding. And so as we speak about development, we have to also acknowledge these chunks of development or transformation that appear in these patterns that can be measured and seen. So Ken very much thinks that all transformational systems should study human adult development, because there are patterns to how people unfold. But some of what's necessary for people to unfold is intentionality is one, as I just said. We notice that the way people tell their own story starts to change, meaning that people will move from kind of idealized narratives of who they are, or heroic narratives of who they are, or degraded narratives of who they are, to growth narratives. Like, we can start to tell a story about transformation, and that's really important. And that's a different kind of story. It's a different way of interpreting our life. Then the tension, you could say, the creative tension of preservation and of innovation, it has to be engaged, because we're deep, deep, deep creatures of habit, and all of our conditioning, whether it's our familial conditioning, our cultural conditioning, all, our just the patterning in the body mind and the impulse of the universe to preserve whatever emerges out of whatever emergence there's preservation. So deep habits from our childhood, deep habits from our wounding, deep habits from our lack of being exposed. Like you would have a much bigger advantage to evolve as an artist if you grew up around artists. If you never saw the creative process, and maybe let's say you had a parent who worked at a mill and had very little choice, then the choice making involved in creativity isn't going to be as innate. So there's the tension of preservation, and then there's this incredible freshness of every moment that there is. Ken often quotes Alfred Whitehead, and he says, he calls it the creative advance into novelty, that every moment has freshness that wasn't there before. And so creative people like yourself are tracking what's possible and what can emerge. But it has to be really kind of the tension of preservation and innovation has to be able to be experienced in the human body. We have to be able to handle it in the mind. Sometimes the newness is too frightening. Sometimes the creative tension is too much for our psyche, and we lapse back into preserving our old habits. Being supported in a community of learners who are wanting to learn the same thing is really essential. And then having good guidance is probably another, it's like the map, the territory. If you have someone who's navigated that territory of transformation ahead of you, super supportive. So that's just a basket of ideas about transformation that come up. Is that satisfying to you in terms of?
Satisfying is an interesting word here. It's interesting. It's like what you said about preservation and innovation for me brings up, I think I said this to you before. There's a French urban philosopher called Henri Lefebvre who talks about the sort of experimental utopia, the idea that you need to be in touch with both the potential of the future of the city and the realness of the existing to be able to actually be in service of transformation. If you just go into utopia, you'll just be dreaming about something that will never happen. And if you stay too committed to the realism, well, then nothing new will come out of it.
Exactly.
So somehow bridging that or being in that creative tension seems to be central.
And that's often the tension that is hard for people to tolerate. You have to encounter disappointment. You get these rushes of expansiveness and possibility, and then the next wave, you're just like bogged down by concrete and steel. How do we, you think about cities, for example, just how preserved they are, and that we build with materials that are really lasting. Although in the States, sometimes it starts to feel like it's disposable cities now. Just tear down a lot really fast. And our attention really gets drawn by the novel. So there's a natural inclination towards what's new. But I would say that in some of the circles that I am, there is an over fascination with novelty and not enough inquiry into the preservation and what actually needs to be preserved. In fact, and maybe you hear this in your circles too, like in social justice circles, burn it down, and burning it down is, in my mind, a complete disrespect for the evolutionary achievements that either individuals or groups or the structures we've created, the institutions, like that, those are all achievements in a certain way. And we have to honor that, even in our own, psychology, physiology, neurobiology. Like there's a lot that's been laid down that's really life-giving to us. And we just want the new, we want the new thing.
Yeah, I guess this is sort of that there's something with actually honoring that this is here. And I think that is the valid critique of the utopian idea that I see, that it's like, well, we can't actually go there. We can't do the new before we see what is real here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that
Exactly.
also connects me
Mm-hmm.
to that is something that's been core in my thinking about change and transformation, which is, I guess it's from Gestalt, really, that like we need to recognize just what's here, and that is what leads to change. It doesn't come by forcing it, it comes by being with like that
Absolutely.
quality.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah, you can't make change when you reject what's right in front of you. And that's one of the things that when I'm working with training facilitators, it's the hardest thing to teach people is how to actually be fully with what is before they make moves, before they try to shift things up.
can
And then
you speak into
let's add
that?
one other. Okay, I'm going to bookmark that for one
Yeah.
quick sec because I want to add one other dimension in here, which is so in some ways you can talk about the creative advance joining with the vision, and this potentiality. And then it's very important to be with the present and the powerful, that which has been preserved and why it's been preserved. And then you could really see in a certain way, like the pull of gravity to be in the shadow, in the sense that then there are things that we don't want to see that actually require us. Like, for example, um, the preservation of cities, but then we really do have to deal with the degradation of the environment. And that's just like, wow, that's just hard. So you've got the vision on the one hand, which is full of, enlightened energy. And then you have this dark, more difficult energy that's hard to work with and engage because it's so heavy. It's hard to even look at it. Or say, let's say the economic injustice that gets held in these structures. And these structures literally help keep people poor, for example. It gets even harder to look at that. And together it gets harder to look at that because that energy is really hard to work with. So sometimes in transformational circles, people get very high dreamy, you could say. They love hanging out in the high dream of the possible and won't deal with the harder. So it's really important for people to have a willingness to deal with different kinds of emotional states and different kinds of energy if they want real transformation. It is not a one flavor endeavor. It has lots of flavors to it. Okay, what was the bookmark?
Uh, the bookmark was you talking about how you train your trainers, or like in training courses, you tell people to stay with what is as, or like the necessity of doing that.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm just curious about, yeah, how that looks for you. Like, what does that mean to
Mhm.
to become better at being with what is before you start
Mhm.
doing?
Well, in a way, it relates a little bit to what we're saying is the habit that I experience in a lot of people who are mediators or facilitators, the people that I train, is that let's take something as simple as a conflict. A conflict arises and the impulse is to make it better. You know, a wave of boredom overcomes the group and the impulse is to get rid of it. And to feel responsible to get rid of it. Um, Another one might be, uh, uh, anytime certain kinds of emotions arise in groups, unless we've done a lot of emotional work, if somebody, for example, starts to experience grief, now you'll be in context these days, traditional contexts don't really allow people to express feeling that directly. Modernist contexts are so busy accomplishing and doing business and running corporations that modernist organizations don't. Pluralist organizations will allow people to really feel and to let, say, an emotion of grief or rage or fear come up. But when it comes up, one of two things happens. Either the facilitator moves to help the group move beyond it quickly because it's shadowy and they don't want to deal with it, or the group gets bogged down in emotion and doesn't know how to get out of it. And so it's always that tension of how do you let something arise? How do you acknowledge it, work with it, be curious, inquire into it, and then help to move and not get stuck in it? Because sometimes that's what happens. So I'm always paying attention to groups and how their vitality is, like how's the life force. And when my North Star is when the group is losing vitality, I want to be curious about it, I want to learn from it, and then I want to help liberate it so the group can continue with its mission or its intention. So that would be an example. Conflict is the big one. Most people don't know how to work with conflict very well, and they tend to just try to quickly compromise or negotiate their way out of it, as opposed to get more interested in these oppositions and learn from them and let them come up and explore them, and then boom, notice that it flipped on its own. You didn't have to do anything. All you were doing is exploring it. But it creates anxiety, and because often when there is a conflict, for example, the mind goes crazy in all kinds of ways. Cognition becomes unreliable, stress hormones drip into the bloodstream. We're basically coping rather than exploring. And so the physiology makes it very hard. So as a facilitator, all the embodiment work that people are doing now to learn how to be with their feeling states more and to understand what adrenaline and cortisol feel like, what happens in the mind, the seeking for safety, the inability to learn, that's all becoming way more in consciousness circles. That's becoming more of a proficiency, and it's absolutely necessary if you're going to work with conflict in a way that it helps people to evolve. And that's my territory. Some people work with erotic energy, some people work with creative projects, some people work with open, free expression. There are all kinds of things. The thing I do best is help people with conflict. Because that was what I grew up in. So that's what that was my medicine I carry. Little homeopathic dose of conflict.
Yeah, and I've heard you say that before, that is sort of the territory that you thrive in, or like do your best work in, is conflict territory. Okay. Can you paint a picture of that? Like what is it that you do really well when you work with conflict?
I would say the first thing I do is I love it. I love the conflict because there's so much truth and there's so much energy. I mean, conflict is, we get very fascinated by the drawing together. I use the erotic opposition, like coming together, that powerful thing. And this is pushing us apart, but it's so powerful. There's so much energy in it, and there's so much truth, and it's very intimate. People don't understand that when they're in a conflict, they're in a deep, really deep relationship. And there's so much potential creativity, and to be able to discover the commonalities and agreements. I like that challenge, that it's appearing as two, like maximum two, but in fact it's completely one underneath. It's just a manifestation of the one becoming two. So how do you honor that? And so for me, it has to do with saying, hey, everybody slow down. This is interesting. Let's go into this little. And I support people in not feeling bad. I support people in overcoming their instincts to move away or defend or avoid or attack. And like, so kind of harmonizing the system enough to explore the difference, and then really helping people with their attention see where there's natural overlaps and commonalities and sameness, and how much the sameness starts to soothe the nervous system. And then boom, it often flips, and you're the person in the opposite role. You're the one wanting freedom. You're the one wanting you're wanting what the other person was asking for. And that's just always super cool when that happens.
Can you get even more concrete on it?
Get even more concrete?
Or can you speak into, this is something I think is unique to you. I haven't heard it from others than you. You speak a lot to sameness and difference as a frame for working with conflict and for being with people. So maybe that's a place to start.
Okay. What I started to do was kind of just to access a lot of the conflicts that I've facilitated, but then also my own conflicts and how I might relate differently to my own conflicts. So I think that it's very, very important for people to start to understand the experience when we experience commonality or we experience sameness. We walk into a room, it's a cocktail party, We don't really know anybody. There's anxiety. We feel separate. We look for the bar. And then suddenly we see somebody that we really like. And we just kind of beeline it for that experience of becoming the same. Because the experience of sameness is relaxing to the nervous system. When we see like-minded people, people who are dressed like we do, people who make the jokes we like, people who use language that we're familiar with, just the nervous system experiences a kind of safety in that. And I always get the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems mixed up because I think they're the opposite of what they should be. The feed and breathe, the relaxation nervous system takes over. But as soon as we start to experience ourselves as separate, there's a slight anxiety, the sympathetic nervous system. There's a little bit of adrenaline, so you can feel trembling, excitement in the body. If there's more cortisol, there's a kind of a uncomfortable stress response, and we start looking for safety. We start looking for it. So hence going to the friend or hence going to the bar just to kind of calm the nervous system. And what's so important about it is that when you start to really understand that and you really understand it on an embodied level, you yourself can work with yourself, but you can also help other people. So when a group there's too much difference and too much adrenaline, then I'll do kind of a sameness exercise. Like, hey, let's just take a minute to feel, everybody. Let's all do exactly the same thing for a minute. Let's just feel and notice what we're feeling. Or let's break into small groups for a minute and just talk about what we have in common right now. Simple little interventions that create a little more, because it's like cooking, if the heat's too high, it's going to burn. And if it's too low, the transformation isn't going to happen. So you've got to get it always in the right range. And when a group is sluggish, when it's complacent, when it's bored with itself, then you can introduce difference. You can start talking about how is it that we don't agree. I sometimes tell the story of working with a group of environmentalists. They were environmental groups that had done a big negotiation with the federal government over preservation of wildlands. And they had had great success, and they asked me to come in for a day and help them just talk over what they'd done well. So we were doing that. I went for a day and we were doing that. And I just was like, something's not right. Like there's just not enough life force in this. I mean, these guys just had a big victory. They should be slapping each other's backs and laughing and kind of throwing, celebrative energy back. And they're just not doing that. It's like flat. What's going on? So that moment, I just decided to introduce a difference. And I said to them, oh, okay, I'm hearing all this great stuff that you did together, but I want to know the ways you betrayed each other in this negotiation. Tell me about how you fucked each other over. Because that's always going on in these things, right? Oh my God, it blew the roof off. It just blew the roof off. Like the life force just changed immediately. And then we started to have an excellent afternoon. It went from window dressing to like reality. And so and that's really kind of approaching the shadow too. When you talk about something like betrayal, you're getting into a difference that's really energized. It's an energized difference because the betrayal is in the interaction, in the interpersonal domain. Betrayal is the extreme of what we don't want, right? We're talking about what is it we do want in relationship. What we don't want is to be betrayed, because you can only be betrayed by somebody who wouldn't betray you. That's all. That's built in, right?
There's something to the way you talked about it right now, where I get this sense of like that it's always there. It's like always possible in some way
It is.
to do these flips, because there will always be some element of betrayal in every group. So it's like you could always bring it in that way. And I'm contrasting that just with how I think about the work I do, where I would often say like, well, if it's in the subtext, it's good to get it into text or make it conscious and get it into the light. Because if we don't do that, there will be like a sense of like something's off because we're not with the real. But
it's always a question of what the energy needs. Because sometimes what happens, for example, when people start doing shadow work and they start engaging the taboo topic or the unspoken topic, then they start to solidify that. And then it becomes oppressive because everything becomes kind of the shadow. Where what I really try to do is like any creative process, like jazz, there has to be a rhythm section. So there's got to be a lot of sameness, and then there's got to be, somebody who's improvising and carrying the melody into new places, and that's got to be there. And so shadow is always available, but it's not always useful. Sometimes it's exactly the opposite of what a group needs. They need to feel a victory. They need to feel they've been loyal to each other. They need to really appreciate, for example, just the the fact that like in this group, for example, the fact they did something really well together, because some people get so magnetized to, and I sometimes think in postmodern groups, sometimes people do get too fixated on difference, and they need to really cultivate more energized sameness, not a complacency, because we're always talking about safety in groups, and a lot of groups feel really unsafe. What's that about? It's really strange. It's like we're cultivating safety, but they feel unsafe. So why is that? You should be curious about that.
Does seem to be some kind of paradox there where
Mm-hmm.
there is like how I find that a lot of the rooms that I engage with have this quality of they're safe enough for us to feel unsafe and to bring in unsafety.
Mm-hmm. Good.
And then there's spaces where that are just not safe enough to actually bring in the anxieties and the
Mm-hmm.
issues.
Yeah.
So at least that's a difference I see between different rooms that I go into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you want to be able to do you want to be able to deepen the bonds enough that people can tolerate like you're saying, they can tolerate and not only tolerate, but really want to explore. There was a little body of research or a research study that they did at Google on there. They had two criteria. One was that they were highly effective teams, they really delivered, but they were also highly satisfied, meaning they liked their jobs, they liked the people they worked with. And they did a little study on those groups. And basically that's one of the things that they said is that the bonds are such and the trust is such in the group that it can bring out the mistake making. They can do critiques in there. They can reveal their shortcomings. They can talk about their frustration, without getting stuck there. So that again is kind of a nice way for us to start to think about. Athletics have to have that. There has to be a lot of sameness and then a lot of willingness for individuals to explore. Cooking has to have those elements of sameness and difference. Music does. So group interactions really need that too. So what you're describing, a group that there's enough safety, because it's great for a group to be dangerous. Where there's safety, there should be danger. If there's not, they shouldn't be there in equal amounts, though. I always think about like predators in nature. It's like where I grew up, there are bears, grizzly bears in the forest. There are black bears too. You need to be really careful when you're in the habitat of bears, particularly of grizzly bears. And so there's that big apex predator, in the oceans. There are all these vast kinds of whales and fish, and then there's just the right amount of sharks, you know? So it's like danger has to be there in the right amount. It can't, if it's too much, a group won't cohere and won't have the bond. But if there isn't enough danger, then there's a kind of irritability that sets into groups, and they start being kind of aggressive towards each other, often passive aggressive. So that's interesting to pay attention to. So health is a like art is a there's a there needs to be equilibrium, but there has to be disequilibrium for us to grow and change, and for groups to really um, be creative together. But you're good at that, so that's one. I mean, you've pretty much devoted your life to being creative in groups. It seems like to me.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear you because I think you used the chef metaphor yourself, or the composer metaphor. I get the picture of you standing in the middle of something, and there's this, yeah, it's like picking ingredients to make something happen
Mm-hmm.
in a way that, well, this is another expression I've heard you use, like liberating life force, or like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, which does feel that there's definitely a parallel to stuff I do, and I feel quite sort of simple in this. I don't feel like I have that many spices to pick from. It's more like what's here,
Mm-hmm.
and there's some kind of commitment to just what is here, and that's what I'm curious about teasing out, because when I hear you talking about this, it's like everything is actually here all the time.
Mm-hmm. For
Um,
sure.
and
For
and,
sure.
and I can
It's
and
all
I can
it's
kind
all
of,
one thing.
yeah,
That's the Buddhist insight. It's we're functioning in oneness. It's all here. Yeah.
and I can kind of see that, but then in my experience, I do have this, like, there is some things have more of a here-ness in the moment. It's like this seems to be what is real right now, or like
Mm-hmm.
there's
Mm-hmm.
this undercurrent happening that we're not speaking into, and when it's spoken to, that seems to enliven the room in a way. Uh,
Yeah.
and sometimes, in my experience, we have to wait for that for a long time, or like we we don't
Mm-hmm.
actually have access to it, and then there's a
Mm-hmm.
period of heaviness or of some kind of
Mm-hmm.
collective suffering going on, and then suddenly someone will be like, "Here's
That
the
that's
truth."
one that's one way it happens for sure. I tend to kind of help groups move through that faster,
Mhm.
a little bit faster, not to spend quite as much time there. Just because it may not be accessible, but something's accessible. And if it is the suffering, then noticing that together sometimes is really helpful. And there's also it's really interesting. Another dimension I think we can talk about, Peter, too, is the individuals who comprise groups. That every group, every moment is completely unique. You have different you may have the same people, but they're in a different mood, you know? You may have the same people, but they've gone through a different thing over the last week. So they're coming in different, that Heraclitus saying you can never step into the same river twice. And it's because it's not the same river and you're not the same person. Everything is always kind of roiling with change, which is really what keeps things really vital. So my existential question, what about impermanence? Well, change is why our reality is just so incredibly dynamic and creative and interesting. And it takes a lot of to practice to be able to tolerate, what comes towards us. So you and I were in a group process together in which it didn't unfold very smoothly. And one of the challenges of being a facilitator in the way that I am is that it depends on a lot of confidence in the facilitation and a lot of trust in the facilitator and sometimes a willingness to follow even when it's not your own impulses to submit a little bit your preferences to try to join and see what it is I'm seeing and go with that. And if I don't have that, and if there are other really powerful preferences, then sometimes, I do get my will in a ditch with groups because then I have to somehow work out how we're working together. And I don't always succeed at that. That's not always, in other words, there may be individuals in the group who have a perfectly good vision of how we should go about what we're doing. And then I can give the facilitation away, or I can uh, work with the individual to see if we can reach a compromise, or I can demand that they really listen to me, that it's very important, and ask for that. But if I can't get the willingness to follow me, then, I'm stuck. And that certainly happens frequently.
Hmm.
And it can change. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't, you know.
Hmm.
So I would say that's the weakness, the inherent weakness in my style, is that it depends a lot on people being willing to, but I mean, I'm also in the context of training a lot these days, so it still happens, because earning trust in a room when you're either leading or facilitating is a real thing. Like, it doesn't work if you don't actually have it. And then if you don't have it, how do you gain it, or how do you give it away? So that at least the group can trust itself, even if they don't trust you. I was in a meeting one time. I was working with the University of Utah in their design and architecture department. And there's a really strong civic architectural community as well as the university. But then the university has this powerful department, and there's a lot of back and forth between the community and the university. And this was a shared meeting of the community and the university. And I had been hired to facilitate this meeting to help them work through some conflicts and some issues. And, we'd done quite a lot of prep work and had an agenda. And there was a particular moment where the dean of art and architecture came to the meeting unexpectedly, and then did what leaders will often do, came into the meeting and started to hold forth, and just took the meeting in a completely different direction. And there was, nobody's going to listen to me. I mean, the dean's here. That's who they want to talk to, right? So I think for an hour and a half, I just had to let go of the reins completely and let the group do what it wanted to do. And then there was a certain moment where they just kind of turned to me, expected me to take over, even though we were doing something entirely different, which I did my best to do. But things like that always happen as well,
Yeah.
So it's an art. We're this to get back to our topic. We're in a kind of an art form, not a kind of an art form. The interpersonal is an art form, and there are different ways to make art. There are different ways to bring beauty out. If art is, and I mean beauty with a big B, I don't just mean pretty. To bring beauty forward is really the function of art. And so we're doing that, and there's so many different ways to do it, and there are many, many valid. The question is, are they bringing beauty forward, and is there life, is there vitality? That's what our job is.
Yeah, I like that. I don't want to hold on to you for too long, but I would like to just explore a little bit with you at the individual level. Like, if from what you've learned, from what you've worked with, what can we do ourselves to relate better? Like, what are the key learnings that you've taken with you? And sort of how do you navigate your relationships more with more beauty? I would call it effortlessness, but what are the important factors?
Ken calls relationships the miracle of we. He says, because we are both entirely the same and we're entirely different. And I think the recognition of that is really, really important. So I do my best to always be cultivating, how am I the same in this moment? How am I different in this moment? And that's what's exciting, is that paradox. Because if I decide to simply listen, let's say to my husband who's been having trouble with his bank accounts and some kind of identity theft, and it's really been a struggle over the course of the last week. And I don't have any guidance. I have moral support, but really what's most important when he's struggling with this is I become one with him by simply just listening and receiving what he's experiencing, reflecting what I'm hearing him say. So the division between us dissolves. So listening is the consummate skill of recognizing sameness, just letting yourself enter the world of the other. And even when you disagree, or even if you have a different perspective, listening doesn't mean agreement. Listening means entering the world and becoming the same as what you're hearing. So that is an act of generosity, and it's the golden skill of relationship. I think the other is to become just much more self-aware about our own patterns of engagement and our own patterns of retreat. What are the habits we picked up in our family that are being enacted. When do we become afraid? What does fear look like in us? What does anger look like in us? What does grief and sorrow look like? And how does it get expressed? I mean, I think the Enneagram, those typologies, those kinds of typologies can be really helpful for becoming more intimate with our patterning, because they help us see ourselves as patterns as opposed to individuals. That there's a set of recurring psychic thinking, feeling, doing patterns that are serve relationships or don't. And so we have to study ourselves first person, I would say. And finally, just kind of get used to get rid of this idealism, the idealism and the degradation. Where there's an idealization of the self, Diane's always right. There's also a degradation. She's never right. We have to substitute that with a growth narrative or a creativity narrative, like this is a new moment. Who am I now? How can I be here? And one of the real challenges there is to be willing to pick up the shadow. So, for example, in a lot of work that I have done over the years with social justice work, when you come and you use the drama triangle of the oppressor, of the victim, and of the rescuer, 90% of the room will identify with the victim. 60% of the room can pick up the rescuer, and very few people want to identify with the oppressor. And you cannot heal and you cannot become creative until every person in that room picks up what an oppressor we are in certain moments. So the idea that we're offloading different things onto others constantly is a habit that has to be broken. We have to see ourselves as the one who's scared in relationship. We have to see ourselves as the one who's dominating. We have to see ourselves as the one who's, impossible. Even if our personality style is more accommodating, we generally get along with people, there are ways in which our own egoic identity is protecting and securing and keeping us separate. And we all have that across the board. So we have to be courageous and brave in terms of being willing to just experience ourselves the way other people experience us, without turning that into a bad thing, because we're all in the same boat. We're all growing together, and our growth we depend on each other for that. You can be self-responsible, but you also have to be engaged with others.
I like hearing that. There's like it brings me in touch with sort of a realness. It's like, well, this is what's here. Like this is sort of, I don't know. I like to access myself through humor, and this like these are ways I'm being ridiculous. It's like, and not in a self-deprecating way, but more like
really genuinely.
I'm doing this thing, and it's like this is apparently how I show up in relationships. Isn't that weird? But like, you recognize this. And which is a quite fun way to be in the world for me. Like I enjoy being with people in that way.
It's a great place for us to wrap it up.
Yeah, sounds really good. Well, thank you so much for talking.
Thank you for talking with me too. I'm just very interested to get to know your methods, and as we get to know each other better, how you do things.
Yeah, perfect.
But I love the kind of open mind that you have, and your genuine inquiry, and your willingness to be present to just what's happening. I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, and I feel really, I still feel impacted from just a moment ago when you talked about listening as sort of, that is the thing that we need to be able to do, and that especially the sentence that listening doesn't mean agreement seems such a fucking core sort of spot on thing, that like if we can just do that thing, like that's a really big step. So thank you for that that clarity.
Thank you.